Way back in 1980, when I had been living in London for around about 4 years, I came across a book in a bookshop that I can say quite honestly changed my life. It was one of these books that I read from cover to cover, and I've read many, many times since. And that book was The Outsider by Colin Wilson. I had known a little bit about Colin Wilson from my past readings, but I'd never really fully appreciated the power of the man and the power of his ideas. Funnily enough, I'd read Wilson in other formats, in the sense of his interest in the occult and beyond the occult. So I'd very much been interested in that side of the world, but I'd never realized in my ignorance just how much of a literary giant he became virtually overnight with this book. And in fact, I just dug out my 1980 copy of the book. Now, thanks to our guest today, I've just recently received a new version of this book, which I will be rereading yet again. Now, the reason I'll be rereading it is because of the most amazing book that I was recently sent by Penguin, the publisher. And the book is written by my associate and good friend Gary Lachman, who has been on this show before. But I have to honestly say that this is one of the best books I have read in so many years. It's the level of just learning and erudition that comes across the pages is amazing. And I think what Gary has done in this book is that he's written a Colin Wilson book in the style of Colin Wilson about Colin Wilson. Because one of the things that I'm sure that Gary will agree with me on this, but because he probably does the same, but I have always based my writing style on Colin Wilson. And by that I mean that you just don't want to read a book about a subject. You want to read a book that drills deeper into what it is to be human. And also a book that on every page you will read something and say, I really have learned something from this. And this is the magic of Colin Wilson that I found, that he really... I used to read Colin Wilson's books, and I'd be going off reading, picking up other books and other writers. There's so many writers that I'd never heard of, that purely and simply because Colin Wilson mentioned them. And I think I have one of the books here that Gary might be interested in, by a guy called Wilbur Wright, this book here. And the only reason I came across this book was through Colin. And it was time and time again. But now what has happened is Gary has written this book, and in it, Gary's really making me understand what made Colin Wilson tick. And all I'm finding is all the time I'm thinking, my God, he's so like me. His world is so like mine. You know, I'm a working class northerner, you know, came down to London in exactly the same way, have the same attitude and values as Colin Wilson. And I suspect probably from the loving way in which Gary writes about Colin Wilson. Clearly, Gary is of a similar opinion as well. So, without further ado, I'd like to offer him my congratulations because we have him here on the show. He's one of our first returning guests who's been on the show before. But this time we're going to be discussing in greater detail, Gary. We'll be discussing Colin Wilson. So, without further ado, Gary, can you tell us a little bit about who Colin Wilson was for the people out there who have not heard of him? And it's still quite amazing how many people have not heard of Colin Wilson. And your involvement with him, because you knew him really well, and as I understand it, you actually read the eulogy at his commemorative service as well. So can you tell us a little bit about him so the readers out there will understand who Colin Wilson is and why people like you and I so much look up to the man?
Well, I mean, Colin, well, first I have to say, Tony, there's nothing I can say is going to be able to meet the goalpost that you've set already here for me, so... it's downhill from here, but no, Colin Wilson, he came to overnight fame and global success in 1956 when he was 24 years old when his first book, The Outsider, came out, and it was the most unlikely bestseller you could imagine, because it was a book about creativity, alienation, and extreme mental states, and It earned the young Wilson the sort of title of Britain's homegrown existentialist. He was writing about existential philosophy, like the first one, really. The novelist Iris Murdoch had written essays about Sartre as well, but Wilson was, someone coming out of the blue. He wasn't from university. He was, as you say, he a working class family, and for years before The Outsider was published, he had tramped around both England and France, moving from menial job to menial job, never staying anywhere long because he couldn't take the boredom, the repetition. He hated working in offices and anything to do with the establishment and, regular sort of bourgeois existence. And he slept rough, and he, worked at everything from being a barrister to being a hospital porter to digging ditches to everything. And all the time he was writing. And he was mostly in the first, before The Outsider came out, he was working on a novel called Ritual in the Dark, which was his first novel, and could be best described as Jack the Ripper meets the brothers Karamazov in 1950s London East End. And it's this existential thriller. And it was while he was writing that, and this is when he developed the legend of sleeping on Hampstead Heath, London's Hampstead Heath, by night while working by day at the reading room of the old reading room in the British Museum. But while he was writing this book, he realized he was taking notes about all these different kinds of characters. People like T.E. Lawrence, people like Nietzsche, people like the little-known at the time German novelist Hermann Hesse, and Wilson lays claim to quite a bit of the credit for the Hesse revival in the mid-'60s and early '70s that I was certainly a victim of, and so there's millions of other adolescent readers in the States and the UK. He just realized there was all these different types of individuals, but they all shared a similar kind of problem, a similar kind of predicament, and it was basically how to achieve a kind of sense of meaning and purpose in this increasingly rationalized, modernized, organized kind of state. There was nothing for people to do. People had a strong creative, spiritual sort of drive. There was less and less for them to do in the world. And these people he dubbed the outsider, and this outsider was a character who had a craving for a sense of purpose and meaning that just couldn't be provided by the world they lived in. And so he collected information and notes about this, and in a few brief months, when he took a break from working on this novel, he wrote this book, The Outsider, and the first publisher he sent it to, Victor Gollancz, accepted it, and Wilson was stunned that the first publisher he sent a few chapters of the book to accepted it, and was stunned even more when the book came out 60 years ago, last May. And as I said, it was an overnight sensation. People like Cyril Connolly, who was the sort of literary doyen at the time, he wrote glowing reviews of it. So did Philip Toynbee, J.B. Priestley, who we've spoken about. He spoke well of it. And even in the U.S., Time Magazine had him photographed leaning against the tree he used to sleep under in Hampstead Heath. Wearing his roll neck sweater and sort of tousled hair and reading a book and all that. And it was the most incredible rags to riches story you could think of. But what happened is, sadly, Wilson was associated with the kind of group of other writers that the literary press had tagged the angry young men. And this is people like John Osborne, who had written the play Look Back in Anger, which is basically a long foot-stomping rant against the welfare state, and people like John Wayne and John Brain and Kingsley Amis and Doris Lessing as well. And for a few months at the end of 1956, they were in the news all the time. They were kind of like, very much like the early rock and roll stuff as well. This is around the same time as Elvis was sort of, hitting the charts and all that, and James Dean had died just a few years earlier. So there was a kind of appetite for young rebel, kind of geniuses, and the angry young men fit that bill for a while, but then the press turned against them, and then they specifically turned against Wilson because out of all of them, he was very earnest. He believed in his, he believed in this mission he had to sort of tell the story of the outsider and this kind of alienated genius in the modern world, and he himself was he's 23, 24 years old. All of his conviction about his own genius and creativity has been proven true by the leading critics of the time. So you can imagine that he might have been quite chuffed, and so he has no hesitation to talk about his own brilliance and all that. So this kind of works against him, and the press turn against him, and he basically escapes from London in about 57. A year later, goes down to Cornwall, and he stays down there for the rest of his life, and he just writes book after book after book, and he spent the 1960s pretty much in obscurity, developing what he called the new existentialism, which has a much more positive, optimistic perspective than the existentialism that was, more well known of Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and so on. And it wasn't until 1971, after he had accepted a commission to write a book about the occult, which he only accepted because he said he needed the money. I mean, he had read books about the occult, and his grandmother was a spiritualist, and something that he knew about, and he had even written about it a little bit in some of his books. In one of his early novels, a character is based on Aleister Crowley, and he did an early book about Rasputin. But it wasn't something that he took, very, very seriously. He was much more interested in, existential philosophy. But this book, subsequently called The Occult, as he did the research for it, he was convinced that there was something much more here than just kind of haunted houses and superstition, that there really was something there. And it became a whole new area for him to explore and to include in this philosophy of consciousness that he had been developing over the years. And this was his comeback book. When The Occult came out in 71, he was back on the bestseller lists. And for a while he was getting good reviews, and then he had this new career as a writer on the occult and the paranormal. And he did that. Another book, a follow-up, came out in 78 called Mysteries, which is an even bigger book than The Occult, which was a big book, in which he brings together everything at the time, astral travel, out-of-the-body experiences, lucid dreaming, Gurdjieff, Crowley, everything that was hething at the time. And as you know, sort of from the mid-70s on, it was a real occult jamboree. He wrote a great deal about T.C. Lethbridge and pendulums and ley lines and earth magic, and he just brought everything together within the context of the philosophy of consciousness. And that's what he was known for mostly for the rest of his career, as well as writing on crime. He wrote quite a bit about crime, true crime books that are just sort of sensational, page-turning, good read, and also more intellectual, serious books. He wrote this massive book called The Criminal History of Mankind, which is sort of like his version of H.G. Wells' The Outline of History, but from the point of view of sort of crime. And he understands crime, and especially violent crime and murder, in terms of this philosophy of consciousness, in terms of this new existentialism, in terms of this character of the outsider. And he sees many kinds of crimes being motivated by this sort of frustrated creativity, a kind of frustrated, a sort of creativity that's curdled, that's gone sour in the individual. The individual is not strong enough to impose his creative vision on the world, but he feels himself to be different and whatever, more creative, more significant than the people around him, and so he takes it out in these sort of acts of crime that are some kind of twisted acts of freedom. So in any case, but he one of the problems with Wilson is that he wrote a lot about different things, even though they're linked together. But unless, like myself, you're a Wilson obsessive, you usually don't read all the books. So you might have read a book on the occult or a book on crime or maybe one of his novels, but you don't necessarily see the connection between them. And I think this is something that worked against him. And he even said at different times that I've interviewed him that was one of the problems, that he wrote too much about too many things. And also the fact that he made a living as a writer, which was very hard to do, even when he was doing it. It's hard enough to do now, but it was hard when he was doing it as well. But what I tried to do in my book, Beyond the Robot, the life and work of Colin Wilson, is to kind of say, okay, this is the basic philosophy here. Here's his sort of life narrative, and here's the trajectory of his ideas. And what I try to do mostly is ground everything else that he writes in this early work on existentialism and his attempt to sort of arrive at a new positive kind of philosophy of consciousness.
So how did you meet him? How did the circumstances come about whereby the young Gary Lachman, the rock musician, ended up with being not only meeting but becoming a very good friend of the elder statesman of so many of us growing up at the time we grew up?
Well, I first came across his book, The Occult, when I was playing in Blondie many years ago. In 1975, I was 19 and I was living on the Bowery, and this was the days of CBGB, if you're familiar with that time, and bands like the Ramones and Talking Heads and Patti Smith and all that. So it was in that milieu, and I had read, Sartre and existentialism and kind of the counterculture books and all that, and but I had no real interest in anything to do with the occult. I just wasn't that interested in it, but. There was sort of, excuse me, all this kind of cultural debris left around from the previous generation. So books like Timothy Leary or Castaneda or stuff like that would be hanging out on sort of older hipsters' bookshelves. And one of where we lived on the Bowery in this dilapidated illegal off space, one of the people sharing this building with us was a fellow named Benton, who was a wild artist. And he was into Crowley. He was into Aleister Crowley. And he used to do tarot cards. He would do these impromptu readings. And he did these paintings based on Crowley's tarot cards. And I just, I became interested in it. And, mostly Crowley had written a book called Diary of a Drug Fiend. And along with many other people at the time, I was interested in drugs. And so, this must be a good read or something. So I got into that. And then gradually just got interested in the occult and the whole kind of occult revival that was going on then. And it was in the midst of that I came across Wilson's book, The Occult. And it just struck me, as I said before, what struck me about it was that it wasn't just a book about ghosts or spells or something like that. He was trying to understand the occult in terms of this philosophy of consciousness. Now, when I first read it, I didn't know much about Husserl and phenomenology and so on and so on. But he did, Nietzsche turns up in there and Sartre and these other people and Hesse, people that I did know about. And so I thought, this must be really interesting. And I just was completely taken with it. And so I just started reading all his books and tracking them down. A couple years later, and I moved to Los Angeles. I came across a copy of The Outsider. And it was one of those books where you feel like, oh, yes, he's writing for me. He's writing about me, all that kind of thing. I know exactly what he's talking about here. And I annoyed everyone around me by trying to make it perfectly clear that I was one of these outsiders and not like all these normal people around me, that kind of thing, as you do when you're about 20 years old or something. So, but I just went book after book, started hunting them down. And when I was a musician, whenever we'd go on tour, go to different cities, first thing I would do is go find the secondhand bookshops and track his books down. And also, there was a great old bookshop which no longer exists in Los Angeles that used to import a lot of UK paperbacks. So along with Wilson, they would also have people like Lyle Watson, Stan Gooch, who wrote these wonderful books about Neanderthal man, and then also these books by Francis King about Crowley and magic and stuff like that. So he was in the context of this sort of pre-New Age. It wasn't quite called the New Age yet. It was just about going to be called the Aquarian Conspiracy, I think, in the States. That was the sort of the name with Marilyn Ferguson's book that came out in 1980. But Wilson was part of this, this interesting stuff to me that was coming out of the UK. And so I just read and read and read, and at some point I started corresponding with him, as one does. And in 1983, by which time I had dropped out of music and wasn't doing anything really. I was some songs of mine did fairly well, so I was able to live on my music royalties for a while. And with a friend, and both of us were involved in the Gurdjieff work at this time. We went on this kind of mini search of the miraculous. We went to Europe for 2 months, and so went to places like Chartres, and we found Gurdjieff's Prairie in Fontainebleau. And we went to Glastonbury and places like that, Stonehenge and Avebury and this kind of thing. But I think the last 2 weeks or something, we went our separate ways. We split up, and one of the things I wanted to do was go down to Cornwall and meet Colin Wilson. And I hitched or took the train or took a coach or whatever, and I remember finding, somehow I got a phone number for him. I don't remember how I got the phone number. I think there used to be a bookshop in London called the Village Bookshop that was on Regent Street. And I think I may have got the phone number for him from there, because they republished, they also did a kind of small, publishing, and they republished some of his novels. In any case, armed with his phone number, I found myself down in Penzance, and I just called him in a phone box. And he was very, very warm and friendly and said, of course, yes, you'd like to come. That's very helpful. We can put you, that's very good. We can put you up for the night and all that. And he told me, take the train to St. Austell. I'll meet you there. And he did pick me up. And I just, went and spent the day and yes, got to know him. His mother was living with him then. And I remember the first thing that struck me was that I'd never seen so many books before outside of a bookshop. Just this place he'd lived in since 1958 was just filled floor to ceilings, with books. And there's different estimates about the number of books he had, but somewhere between 30 and 40,000, copies of books there. Plus, at the time, I guess he was starting to collect VHS, tapes and cassettes, and then later on over the years, when I visited as well, there was many, CDs and DVDs and so on and so on. He had an enormous number of books. And then also what I remember is a long wine-fueled evening when he was trying to explain phenomenology to me. And at the time, I swore I understood it just before I hit the sack. But the next day when I woke up, I couldn't quite put my finger on it again. I'm spending the last 33 years trying to do that now. No, it was fantastic. And we just stayed in touch after that. And we corresponded. At one point when he was in Los Angeles, I, at the time, was working at the Bodhi Tree Bookstore, which was the metaphysical bookshop west of the Rockies. And I was house sitting for one of the owners, and they had this wonderful sort of modern house up in the Hollywood Hills, equipped with a jacuzzi and sort of terrace garden. And I just spurred the moment, I said, well, if you're coming to LA, why don't you stay? I can put you up here instead of staying in a hotel and all that. So he and his wife Joy, they came and stayed. It was about a week maybe, because he had quite a few talks. We had parties there and all that kind of thing. So just got to know each other over time. And gradually, I started writing myself. I always wanted to write. It wasn't until the early 90s that I started writing anything that anyone would publish. I started doing book reviews and articles. And one of the first things I wrote was a long life review article about Colin for a journal called Revision that Ken Wilber used to edit, but at the time it was Richard Tarnas, who wrote that wonderful book, Passion on the Western Mind. He was editing it. So he asked me, I wanted to write, so I wrote that. And then I also published a few early things with, there's a small press called Pauper's Press that comes out of Nottingham. A fellow named Colin Stanley, who's another Colin Wilson devotee, who's Wilson's bibliographer, and has published, I said, lots of Wilsoniana, either small bits of Wilson's or bits about him by many of the people. He just became sort of, a friend and a mentor, and as you say, a kind of guide to writing, style, in the sense that you just want to have something to say and say it as clearly as possible. And I think the thing about Colin's writing is that you're with him as he's thinking his way through these things. It's not as if he has it all and he's just sort of going, here it is, here's the doctrine, here's the teaching. He has a question, and you follow him, and he takes you along. And I forget who said it, but someone said that Wilson had a narrative style that would make, the phone book sound exciting. And it is. He has this wonderful style where he just keeps taking you along. And you think, oh, yes, here's the answer. But actually, no, if we think of it like this, and then there's some more stuff, and then you have this wonderful overview. And he's a great encyclopedist. That's one of the things about it. I remember I asked him once, did he intend to outright H.G. Wells, and he laughed, but I think he has, or he did at this point. And like Wells, many of his books are saying the same thing, but if you're interested in what he's saying, that's fine. You don't mind. You don't mind hearing it again in a different way. No, I couldn't have written this book until after he passed away. That's people have asked that before, and I just said, well, I'd love to write about him, but I couldn't do it while he was still alive. and as soon as I found out that he had, passed on, because he had been ill for quite some time. He had a bad stroke, left him, paralyzed, and it must have been a great challenge for him because he was unable to read and unable to write, even speak for quite some time. But as soon as I heard that he had passed on, I got in touch with my publisher, Penguin, in the States, Mitch Horowitz, my editor there, who I've done quite a few books with. And I said, I really want to do this book. I'm going to give you for a shot at it. It might not be, you might not think it's good for your list. And at first he said, well, I tell you the truth, I don't know that much about Wilson. I don't think too many people know enough about him to be able to sell the book. And I convinced him. I said, look, I'll take a smaller advance, read these books, read the stuff that I've written about him. And he came back to me. He said, my God, thank you so much for telling me about him and, turning me on to him. And yes, let's do this. So he's very happy. And that's one reason why this new edition of The Outsider came out, is that Penguin already had the rights to it. And I said, well, it's the 60th anniversary of the book coming out. So that warrants something. That warrants some kind of commemoration. And if you are going to do, my book, put out a new edition of The Outsider. So he thought that was a good idea, and then I agreed to do an introduction to it as well. So what I'm trying to do is kind of kickstart a kind of revival, or at least, get people to see how important a writer and thinker he was, and that he did have a kind of solid body of ideas that informed all of these many, many books he wrote.
It's quite interesting that when I was in contact with him when I first started writing, and he was very supportive, and I think he had a reputation for being very supportive of new writers, and indeed I was warned, which is rather sad, that he tended to be somebody that wrote the forewords of many, many books, and therefore to have Colin Wilson write the foreword of his book was not necessarily the thing it used to be. But I was so keen to have that. But what he did do, he said, my first book is The Life After Death. He made the wonderful comment and said that this wonderful book reminds me of my favourite movie, Groundhog Day. And it's the same kind of, Anthony Peake's book's very much like a kind of ride on Big Dipper. But the last time I was in contact with him was when I did an event down in Devon, and it was a really sad reply when he said, I'd love to come, but I rarely leave Cornwall anymore. And clearly you were aware of the fact at the time that he was not a well man. But the one thing that, well, there's many things I love about your book, but I think the major thing is I now feel I know him as a human being. He was always this kind of elder statesman and somebody that could write with incredible knowledge over so many subjects. He was a total polymath. And he just seemed kind of distant because he never used to push himself into the books, the occult and beyond the occult and mysteries. He was writing almost as a cipher. He had this wonderful style where he had sections of the book, and you could go to the front of the book and you know straight away where he was going to be going.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas
the analytical table of contents, which I think is important.
Yes.
And again, Wells. If you look at Wells's old books, Wells had those.
Of course.
He has a long thing that says, Homo sapien, and man discovers fire, or whatever. It's all kind of that's what's going to happen in that chapter. But
of course, because
I agree. I mean, the thing is, you're right. He does. There's not a lot of I, but you're always aware of him being there. There's this fiery need to know and intellect that's at work, and he's so alive to ideas. And the thing is that he read so much. I mean, I say in the book and elsewhere that if you follow up all the leads that he presents in the books, it's like getting a liberal arts education. I mean, that's
totally
what I did. I mean, so many people I went on to read from reading him, like David Lindsay, John Cooper Powys, J.B. Priestley, just to name writers, and you just find yourself tracking these people down, and you think, okay, I see why he was interested in them. And, and then all three of those writers, I went off and read all the, not Priestley because he wrote as much as Wilson, but David Lindsay, who wrote Voyage to Arcturus, this fantastic Gnostic truly not a true work of Gnostic literature, unlike so many that are given that title these days. And John Cooper Powys, who's one of the great metaphysical, what do you want to call, novelists. His Glastonbury Romance has to be one of the most incredible works of imagination in the 20th century. And these are people like Colin themselves who weren't taken seriously by the literary, establishment, and which I thought was very funny, because when for sake of anything better to do with my life, for a brief while, I thought I was going to be an academic. So I went back to university for a while after my rock and roll days, and I was going to do philosophy and sort of comparative literature, and everything was about sort of dismantling the Western canon and getting rid of all these dead white European males and bringing in all this new fresh stuff. But if you tried to bring in Colin Wilson or John Cooper Powys or David Lindsay, nobody knew who these people were. Harold Bloom mentions, I think, David Lindsay somewhere, but nobody ever talks about Wilson anywhere. In fact, I remember talking to the professor I had at University of Southern California and saying, I wanted to write about him, and he said, well, he would be someone you could write about as a cautionary tale about, basically hubris and why you shouldn't talk about your genius too much and all that. So actually, no, it's the other way around. That's why I admire him, so they didn't want anything to do with him. And in relatively recent years here in London, you have a couple different people, literary figures, saying, oh yeah, when I was a teenager, The Outsider was a good, it was an important book for me, but I've since grown up and all that kind of thing. And I have to say, so far, the thing that's given me the most pleasure or joy, aside from the book being published, is that it got this really good review in the Washington Post by Michael Deirdre, who's a mainstream literary critic. He's not somebody who's associated with the occult or New Age or mysticism or anything like that. And he just raved about the book, and he basically also said, Wilson's somebody who's been ignored for decades, and he really shouldn't have been. And the other one was Philip Pullman, who strangely enough, I just noticed that he followed me on Twitter, and I thought, this has got to be a joke, this has got to be some kid or some guy calling himself Philip Pullman. And I just noticed it, and then at one point I said, God, I guess it really is him. And I knew that he had said good things about Wilson in an interview. So I just said, would you mind my sending you a copy of the book? And if you feel like saying something about it, fine. If not, that's okay. I don't mind. And he wrote back this wonderful, endorsement for it. I mean, so wonderful that Penguin put the whole endorsement on the cover of the book. So it's good that you have some literary mainstream heavy hitters, speaking well of him. And I think that's what needs to be done, because there's so much there. He wrote so much. Everybody knows The Outsider, and then later on they know the occult, but they don't know the connecting links between all these things. They don't know all the literary criticism. They don't know the works on psychology. He wrote one of the early people, or the few people that take him seriously, was Abraham Maslow, the father of humanist psychology. Maslow was very influenced by Wilson's book. It's called The Age of Defeat in the UK, and it was called The Stature of Man in the US. And it was about the loss of the hero in modern culture and in modern literature, and sort of the kind of lowering of human self-esteem, basically, the effect this was having. And Maslow was very very much taken with Wilson's ideas, and vice versa. Wilson incorporated a lot of Maslow's ideas. Basically, the notion of the peak experience, these sort of sudden moments of joy, happiness, bliss, whatever you want to call them, just the sense that life is good, what priestly called magic or delight, just coming out of nowhere. Maslow felt these were natural, spontaneous sort of manifestations of human psychology, but they came unbidden. You couldn't make them happen. And Wilson thought, well, actually, maybe you can. And he sort of, developed the whole philosophy based on intentionality and intensity of consciousness and so on. But again, it's not a question of his philosophy isn't about, let's go have peak experiences. Peak experience for him is a sign that the kind of pessimistic, nihilistic existentialists like Sartre or Camus or Heidegger came to are not necessarily true. There are moments when, rather than have this nausea moment or absurd moment where the meaning of life seems to dissolve, actually you have moments when there's an overwhelming meaning. In fact, there's too much meaning. And the reason we don't see the meaning all the time is that if we did, we'd be sort of, knocked down by it. We'd be stopped in our tracks. So we have to edit out a great deal of it in order to just get on with things. This is what Huxley said, and this is what you talk about in the beginning of your most recent book, Opening the Doors of Perception. Huxley he references C.G. Broad, who references Bergson, but the whole idea that rather than produce consciousness, the brain is a kind of damper on it. It's a UHF kind of thing that tunes it out. And if we didn't have it, we would just be overwhelmed by the enormous meanings that surround us all the time. But the problem is that we cut out too much of it. It works too well. The editor he's too good. He's taken out a bit too much, and he's left us with too dry of a text. And so we have to somehow be able to go in and open it up and get a few more adjectives in, I guess, or something like that. I'm mixing my metaphors here, but I think you understand what I mean.
No, I do exactly, because funnily enough, I've lived my whole life in the Peake experience for obvious reasons. And when I came across Maslow, I mean, that was news to me. I didn't realize that Maslow was influenced by Wilson. Mm-hmm. So there's something that, that is very intriguing, because funnily enough, I was at an event yesterday in Reading, and I was speaking at the event in Reading, and one of the presenters did a talk on ghosts, semi-tongue-in-cheek about ghosts, because she was thinking about the psychoanalysis of ghosts. And somebody has created somewhere the Maslow's hierarchy of needs for ghosts. And it's very, very funny, it's the idea of what do you want to do,
it's the lowest level.
Yeah, in Peekaboo experience. Very good, that's even better. That's even better. And they were saying things like, find a nice house to haunt, and then do various other things. Really, really good. But some of the things you were saying there are just so accurate in terms of Colin Wilson, and it was his areas of interest. For instance, reading your book, I hadn't realised that he really loved H.P. Lovecraft. And I thought, my word, this is really intriguing stuff.
Again, I think the thing. I'm sorry. No, I was going to say again. Lovecraft is somebody like Gurdjieff and Hesse and Crowley that Colin was writing about well in advance of their broader popular appeal. As I said, The Outsider has the earliest analysis of Hesse's novels in English. Most of them aren't even translated English at the time. And at the end, he's talking about Gurdjieff, and it was only a few years after Gurdjieff had died, and there really wasn't much written about him outside of that, written by people who were involved. And then in another book, part of this, what he called the Outsider Cycle, was a series of six or seven books that he's spelling out, in stages, the whole development of this outsider philosophy. There's one called The Strength to Dream, and it's about literature and imagination, and how our sense of values is connected to our use of the imagination, and vice versa. But the inspiration for this book was that he was saying, I think in a farmhouse in Devon or Dorset or something like that, and the only book available, and wherever he was, sleeping in that room, there was a copy of The Outsider and Others, and it was a collection of Lovecraft stories. It was the first one that August Derleth put together, and understandably, Wilson was interested, in a book that had the title The Outsider, and he hadn't read any Lovecraft before. And he thought, oh my God, he's such an appalling writer, but he sensed this kind of outsider sensibility behind the writings, and he saw Lovecraft as this kind of latter-day romantic who's completely rejects modern society, modern world, and his attempts to terrify the reader are basically his attempts to get back at the modern world and all that. And he was in this first book he took Lovecraft seriously as this kind of symptom of modern society, but he was quite critical of his actual abilities as a writer. And this led August Derleth, who was Lovecraft's savior, basically. I mean, August Derleth was a Wisconsin writer who wrote horror stories as well as many other kinds of stories. But basically, he started this publishing house called Arkham House that saved Lovecraft's writing from pulp oblivion, because he only published a couple pieces of his in any kind of real book form during his life. Everything he wrote was published in these pulp magazines like Weird Tales and things like that. So, excuse me, Derleth came across Wilson's book, Strange the Dream, and he said, well, if you think, Lovecraft's such a lousy writer, why don't you try writing one of his kinds of stories? And so Wilson said, okay. And this was the stimulus for the mind parasites, his science fiction.
Do you know, that's really interesting. That's really, because when you were discussing that then, and you were describing Derleth and everything else, and I knew where you were going to go with that, and I thought, the mind parasites. Of course, it's so Lovecraftian. And I'd never, ever made that link. So I just wanted to go in there just for an interjection. Sorry, please go on.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, that's and that was the thing. And then he did a follow-up one called The Philosopher's Stone, which I personally find it's one of my favorite novels of his, and it's about these two scientists doing experiments on the brain, trying to find where in the brain what part of the brain is responsible for mystical visions or the Peake experience and stuff like that. And part of this involves this kind of time slip experience that Wilson brings into a lot of his writings, and has to do with this idea of faculty X. He talks about the ability to grasp the reality of other times and places, not just to know or remember that they existed, but to actually somehow grasp the reality, which is a different thing altogether. It's the whole Proustian experience where, Proust knew that he spent his childhood holidays in the north of France, but when he tasted the tea tasted the Madeleine dipped in the tea, suddenly it all came back to him in vivid detail, much like Wilder Penfield playing around with your brain kind of thing. And so Wilson did this other, Lovecraftian kind of pastiche novel where in the process of developing this ability to step outside of time, the heroes become aware of the old ones hovering in the back of the universe and so on and so on. And then there was a third one called The Space Vampires, which unfortunately was made into one of the worst films ever of Tobe Hooper's Life Force. I mean, the story with that is that Colin once got a postcard he was in communication with John Fowles, the much more respected and mainstream, established, novelist in England. And Fowles's great novel, The Magus, was made into this real cheesy film with Anthony Quinn, and I forget who was in it. And he in conversation, whatever he told Colin, said, yes, it's made into the worst film ever. And then when The Life Force came out, Colin, I think, sent John Fowles a postcard saying, I did you one better, or something like that. This is the worst film ever. And there were two things good about Life Force, and I'll let your listeners, if they've seen the film, they'll know immediately what those two things are, and I'm not going to say anything about that because it's a bit off.
I was going to make exactly the same comment, because it was on the posters of the film, and that's the reason myself and my friends went to see it, was because of the posters of the film. And in fact, it was only afterwards I discovered that it was actually a Colin Wilson novel. And I'm delighted.
It's such a great film.
Oh, totally. And I'm delighted to know that there is a link between Colin Wilson and John Fowles, because John Fowles is my favourite author, and I have read The Magus. I read The Magus every 5 years, and I have done since I was 22, 23 years of age, because Nicholas Earth I related to so strongly, and now I'm getting so old, you probably would agree with this, I'm relating to Consciouness. I can see what Consciouness is at, which is really, really disturbing. Now, we've got another 10 minutes before we finish. What I'd like to do is for you to explain a little bit about Colin's approach to existentialism, because I was fascinated in the book to discover that he actually met Camus. And again, that's why your book is so wonderful. It's wonderful of those revelations for even people like myself who's loved Colin Wilson for so many years in his writings. I've always thought, well, wonder what would have happened if he'd ever met Camus, because when I read The Outsider, I do recall thinking this is so like The Rebel in so many ways. And the meeting didn't really, I mean, they were obviously having a conversation in Franglais, but the meeting didn't really work. But to finish off, could you explain a little bit about why Colin was disillusioned with what existentialism is for the listeners out there that don't know about it? But more importantly, what was it that made Colin disillusioned to bring about a new form of existentialism, which I think both you and I are very much into? It's the kind of world we live in.
Yes.
So if you could just explain for the last 10 minutes, because I'm sure everybody would be fascinated to hear.
Okay. Well, I mean, the brief thing, existentialism is a philosophy that it started up in Germany in the 1920s with the philosopher Martin Heidegger. He wrote this enormous book called Being and Time, where he basically says that all of philosophy has lost track with this fundamental question of being. What does being mean? When you say something is, what does it mean? What does existence mean? And he's saying, ever since Plato, we've gone down this rational road trying to understand in terms of science and rationality and all of that, but we've lost track with the immediacy of it. But it really became something in the popular mind post-World War II, and it was associated with Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and the left bank, and Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, and, berets and galois and black turtlenecks and Juliet Greco playing French folk songs. And it was basically a philosophy based on freedom, the idea of freedom, and the rejection of all previous kinds of explanations or answers, or what you want to say, kind of supports for human existence. So Camus says we have to live without appeal, meaning that we can't appeal to any kind of supernatural dimension to give us meaning, God, or the Platonic forms. And also ideas of like progress, that 19th century notions of progress and this kind of forward drive. World War I, World War II kind of put pay to those ideas. So man finds himself in this world without any kind of transcendental support. The only kind of meaning is the meaning we make in the world. And what people like Sartre and Camus and Heidegger, much of their philosophy is based on showing up the illusions by which most other people live. People believe in, you get up every day, you go to work, and there's a reason you have to do that, and whatever it is, and fundamentally this is kind of a delusion, this is kind of an illusion. These are kind of false, what Sartre called bad faith. Because freedom is terrifying, and we want to avoid it, and so we create illusions about ourselves in order to give explanations. And Sartre's famous novel, Nausea, the hero, the kind of explanations or answers or meanings that everything around him that hitherto had suddenly drop away. And so he's like he has a doorknob in his hand and he doesn't know what it is. Or he's looking at the roots of a chestnut tree and it's sheer isness is so overpowering to him that it terrifies him, because he finally just recognizes that it exists. I used to call it a tree. I understood it in terms of botany, but all of this is just a kind of coding. This thing is just there, whether I exist or not. And for Sartre, human existence is a kind of emptiness. Now, the reason I'm going on that level is to show that Colin appreciated the kind of analysis of self-delusion that the first wave of existentialists carried out. And he even talked about in some of his books, he had an ongoing idea for a book called The Methods and Techniques of Self-Deception that he wanted to write. But, excuse me, where he differed from them is that he felt that they left out these kinds of experiences, like the Peake experience. They left out of their account of human existence, which they based on, I can only say this very briefly, the German philosopher Edmund Husserl's idea of phenomenology, which basically meant, let us forget about everything we think we know about the world. Let us put aside all of our scientific explanations or religious explanations or anything like that, and just confront the phenomena themselves. Because he's like Heidegger, Husserl felt that we have become lost in all these explanations we have of things and reasons and the Kantian Ding an sich and thing in itself and all that. And he said, let's put all that aside and let us just try to describe as clearly and as accurately as possible what our existence is and what these things are. And Husserl had the idea of what he called, Husserl's fundamental idea was that consciousness was intentional, that consciousness is always consciousness of something. You can never have a blank consciousness. But also, not only that it was directional, but that there's actually a kind of willed intention behind it. But this isn't something that we do voluntarily, consciously. This kind of willed intention of perception is taking place on a deeper level of the mind, something that we don't have immediate access to. But in these moments of, these peak moments, or moments of mystical experience, or moments of poetic or aesthetic, or even sexual kind of ecstasy, we suddenly become aware of a deeper self, deeper parts of our being that most of the time we're just not aware. We didn't realize they even existed. And in those moments, what we experience, he says, is not this nausea, not this kind of absurdity, but actually this kind of overwhelming meaning. There's so much meaning. This is why all mystical experience, mystics say, we can't really talk about it. It's ineffable. What Colin would say, it's very effable. We just have to work at trying to say it. We have to develop a language in order to say it. And also we have to use the phenomenological techniques of analysis to get at what is the structure of the Peake experience? What's the structure of these kind of mystical experiences? People like Sartre and Camus and Heidegger, they felt this was too much like going back to religion. This was too much like, no, you're kind of going back to, old God in some way is you're bringing him in to help us out, and we can't allow that. And Wilson felt, well, no, we're not doing that at all. There's nothing supernatural about this. The kinds of experiences Maslow was talking about, they came to a mother getting breakfast ready for her children, or they came to a Marine who hadn't seen a woman in a couple of years, who just, been on some jungle camp somewhere, and he goes back to the main base and he sees a nurse for the first time in 2 years, and he's suddenly amazed that women are very different than men. So it isn't some mystical. The content of the Peake experience or the content of the mystical experience is generally the same content of the everyday experience, but we see it for the first time with this kind of intentionality. We become aware of ourselves as active agents somehow reaching out and grabbing it. So this is a very simplistic and short kind of run through of the differences between Collins and the previous existentialism. But he wanted to keep the kind of existential analysis of existence without having to sort of refer to anything outside of our existence, which is what existentialism doesn't want. We can't talk about God. We can't talk about the great Platonic forms. We have to stick to our everyday experience. But he wanted to base his existentialism on these kind of Peake experiences, on this kind of intensity experience. And this is what the outsider wants. The outsider is an outsider because he craves this kind of the phrase I use, life more abundant. We want to have this more vividness of life, and our nice, pampered, welfare state, everyday existence there's no room for that. And so the outsider is, going crazy because he needs this kind of intensity. And all the books after the outsider, Colin basically was trying to come up with a way through certain mental processes to be able to arrive at that kind of intensity.
What Colin called the St. Neot's margin, which I thought was really good.
Exactly, what he calls the indifference threshold. He
the
says
idea
we're all
of
subject to this thing he calls the indifference threshold, and usually it's crisis of inconvenience that pushes us past it. And this is why the outsiders that he writes about, all of them went out of their way to create very, very inconvenient or difficult, even dangerous circumstances for themselves, because they felt more alive in the midst of them. Sartre himself said he never felt so free as when he was in danger of being arrested by the Gestapo, during the occupation of France and all that, which sounds ridiculous. You would think you'd feel more free when you weren't. There wasn't any chance you were being arrested. But no, unconsciously we start to take life for granted. And that's what this is the whole robot business. If I can say that 2 seconds.
Again, because you mentioned in your book, about Dostoevsky and the fake firing squad, and that struck home to me because I've used that analogy in my works. Mm-hmm. But funnily enough, I'm reminded as we come to the end, I'm reminded to bring in a little bit of humour here, is that way back in 1973, when I was leaving to go to university, my then girlfriend Christina gave me a copy of Nausea. And there you are, you're away from home, you've left your girlfriend, you don't know anybody, you're stuck in this little room in a campus university, and what are you reading? Nausea. And, it really had a profound effect on me, very, very badly. Fortunately, I then fairly quickly discovered Hermann Hesse and various other writers, so therefore I was rather saved. But that book and Steppenwolf really played on my sort of 19-year-old brain, and those books do, don't they?
Steppenwolf is a Bible for me, I have to say. But I mean, I think it's the thing with nausea. It's like, I think it's a stage one has to go through. You know, we more or less, you know, you live life unquestioningly. You just accept everything. Then something happens, and suddenly life is stranger than you thought it was. It's more mysterious. So the pessimistic existentialism stays at that level. Life is this weird, meaningless kind of thing, and, you know, I basically have to confront it all the time. But Colin took it, you know, further. And Steppenwolf is one of these characters because he feels that nausea, but he also has those moments when, you know, he's reminded of Mozart and the stars, and he realizes that, you know, he's actually involved in something much bigger than his own small life. And Steppenwolf is that's one of the books that Colin writes about at length in The Outsider, and it was one of the earliest, if not the first, sort of extended analysis of it in English.
Gary, it's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Really, really enjoyed it. And one of the things I think that's symptomatic of the need that people like you and I think an awful lot of the listeners out there and Dear and everybody else, is this finding of other human beings that have, a similar worldview and a craving, a desire for understanding. Yes. And this is what I love about your writing, is that, you know, that it is so keen to just understand. And I think that is of profound importance. And I think maybe we should sort of set up a kind of Wilsonian worldview or something of that nature, because funnily enough, my next book, which I'm working on at the moment, will be a work on J.B. Priestley, and I'm going to be doing a very similar approach to J.B. Priestley to what you have done with Colin Wilson, because I was quite surprised as to how many times they overlapped, and I've recently found a wonderful review by Colin Wilson of one of J.B. Priestley's later quasi-autobiographical books, which is absolutely wonderful. And I really enjoyed reading it. So there's two of my literary heroes, you know, discussing each other in some way, yes, which is wonderful.
Well, there's a book, Over the Long High Wall, I think it's called, Priestley, one of his last books. And Colin talks about that quite a bit. His book, Beyond the Occult.
Yeah, Beyond the Long High Wall is just a wonderful book. I'm about to start rereading it now. But Gary, one of the things you'll find fascinating is that I have now got a copy of the transcript of a J.B. Priestley time play that's never ever been produced and has never ever been appeared. Yeah, and funnily enough, I've got a meeting in North London. I've got a meeting in North London with a guy called Graham Murray, who is a top playwright guy, founded one of the major theatres in Manchester. And Graham and I are meeting in a few weeks' time to discuss how we take this play forward in terms of I'll be writing about it. And I'm hoping to when I'm up in North London, I'm hoping to maybe we can discuss it elsewhere, but to probably catch you later in that day, because I've got one or two ideas about us working together.
I'm a North London boy. I'm there now, right now as we speak.
Absolutely. Well, I still think that, and we've discussed this many times, that maybe the Gary and Tony show could really sort of blow a lot of socks off, and I think the time is about right now to be going down that route. So, you heard it here, folks. You heard it here first time, folks. Okay, thanks very much, Gary. And again, as always, thanks to Radia Nunez in the background there, quietly beavering away, making sure that everything happens. Next month, my guest will be David J. Brown, who has written a series of books on dimethyltryptamine and associated experiences. I'm really looking forward to this one as well. But Gary, thank you again. But thank you so much for the book, because wonderful, wonderful book. And my review will be going up on Amazon. No, I certainly did. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll be in touch. Okay, thank you.
All right, take care, Tony. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, see you. Bye.